Back in the 1980s and 90s, there was a regular occurrence of video games being renamed region to region. Sometimes this was for better understanding the content of the game, such as Garu Densetsu being called Fatal Fury in the West, or when Daimakai Mora was changed to Ghouls and Ghosts. There was also a ton of changes for games where licensed content came into play. Titles like Super League became Tommy Lasorda Baseball, Hokuto no Ken turned into Last Battle, Super Real Basketball was rebranded as Pat Riley Basketball. The addition of the man that knocked out Mike Tyson meant that Final Blow became James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. Some games even got additional text in the title, or some had it moved around completely. eSWAT City Under Siege was Cyber Police eSWAT in Japan, Sword of Vermilion was simply Vermilion, and Kid Chameleon was curiously moved around to Chameleon Kid. And it wasn't just Japanese games that had different names. Sometimes it worked that way between other regions as well. Zombies Ate My Neighbors in the US was known simply as Zombies in many European nations. Sonic 3D Blast was Sonic 3D, Flicky's Island. Pack Attack was Pack Panic, and Cybercop was Corporation. Back in the day, it was real easy to not know when a game was renamed, especially with no internet to research anything. Best you had was bad pics in gaming magazines. With so many games having different names, I decided to do an episode talking about some of the bigger games that saw name changes, and even go over some of my cover art preferences with these titles. We've got a lot to go over, so let's get started. I saw Super Airwolf on Mega Drive gaming lists for a while, and always wondered what it was. I had visions of Thunderblade style action with great graphics and big explosions. A while later I learned that I had played it already when it came west as Crossfire. Since Acclaim had the rights to the Airwolf license in the US, it had to be called something else. It was an overhead vertically scrolling shoot 'em up run and gun hybrid that was just okay. It had variety in the two gameplay types, but didn't do anything special in either area, and there are far better games in these genres on the Genesis. There are some musical changes between the regions, but otherwise it's the same game. The company that published it didn't even redo the cover art, which stinks no matter the region you get it in. It was a good example of needing to be careful when importing games way back then. Just because an import title sounded new and interesting didn't mean it hadn't already been localized under a new name. The prominence of the Revenge of Shinobi meant I was aware of its Japanese name, the Super Shinobi, even back then. What I didn't know were the many differences between not just the regions, but also the revisions to the Western releases. When this was released originally in Japan, it was version 1.0, which had all the pop culture content like Sonny Chiba at the title screen, the Godzilla, Spider-Man, Batman, and Terminator bosses, and the Rambo guys. When it came west, it was revised a bunch of times on the Genesis, each time changing something about those pop culture icons. This can have a massive impact on the one you want in your collection. Also important was the cover art on this one. While the Japanese release was just a plain reuse of the title screen, I really enjoyed the US and European art, which in a rare turn, looks so much better. Target Earth was known as Assault Suit Linos in Japan. This was fairly well known from the get-go, I think, mainly because this run and gun has some serious challenge and became a cult classic really early on. But what I wanted to show you here was the cover art specifically. In Japan, you got this beautiful front and back featuring well-drawn mecha, while the US got some Cylon reject from the 1970s. It's not even an argument which is better. The Japanese version even has a cool looking instruction manual. It really is a shame DreamWorks changed it. Seeing Fat Man for a year in the import ads of my favorite magazines gave me visions of a Super Mario ripoff or some crazy spin about Santa Claus. You can imagine my surprise when Slaughter Sport released in North America and I realized it was a fighting game all along. A very crappy fighting game at that. You won't find many titles in that genre on the Genesis, and this is easily among the worst. It's slow, the AI just keeps spamming you incessantly, and every other move knocks you down. This was never officially released in PAL regions, which I'm sure would have just been renamed again to avoid association with the terrible reviews it received elsewhere. For what it's worth, this is an instance where the Japanese box art almost makes the game worth owning all by itself.
Welcome to the Fight Palace.
Darius II was a direct sequel to Taito's original side-scrolling arcade shoot-'em-up classic. When it was originally released on the Mega Drive in Japan, it kept the arcade name there, but when the North American and European regions got it, it was called Sagaya. I was always a bit mixed on this one. The Genesis port was a fair representation of the arcade's gameplay, and had some nice background effects, but it lacked variety and repeated a ton of assets and just recolored them. It also had a really weak power-up system. On a platform with so many excellent shoot-'em-ups, I find this one really easy to forget. It's not bad by any means, but just not something I'd call a must-have either. For those of you that are curious, the PC Engine CD version was called Super Darius II. Talk about one that needed a name change. Gaina, or Genogu, or however the hell you want to say this game's name, was a 1991 shoot-'em-up that was really quite good. Great effects, fun boss fights, and cool backdrops paired well with the solid challenge. When it was released in the US later that year, it was renamed Wings of War, a name that just wasn't far easier to pronounce, but fit the theme of the game quite well. You'll notice that war is spelled with an O, which is the name of the winged warrior you play as. The European release kept the Japanese name and the cover art, which also differed quite a bit in the US. I like this game no matter what it's called, but I admit I prefer the US name a lot more. Namco's Marvel Land is a side-scrolling action game originally released in the arcade. When the Genesis port came home in the US and Japan, it retained the same name in both regions, but changed around some of the name of the characters. In Japan, the hero is named Prince Paco, whereas in the US he is called Prince Talmit. The princess you need to rescue is called Luxie in Japan, and Wandra in the US. The PAL regions retained the character name changes from the US, but went a step further by changing the title to Talmit's Adventure. This one isn't going to give Sonic much of a challenge, but as far as arcade ports go, it's a very solid recreation of the original. Give it a chance, it's good clean fun and a great challenge. When it comes to memorable titles, few on the Genesis drum up the feels like the Streets of Rage series. All three of these classics were excellent, and must-owns for any beat-em-up fan of the platform. But back in Japan, Streets of Rage was known as Bare Knuckle, and featured very different box art. This was also the case with the second game in the series. Again, Japan held on to the name change and radically different box art. There was also a name change for one of the selectable fighters. Skate from the Western Streets of Rage 2 was called Sammy in the Japanese version. When Streets of Rage 3 came out, the changes went much further than just names. Bare Knuckle 3 in Japan again had different box art, but also had a different story, numerous character name changes and censorships, and was much more manageable in terms of difficulty. When Sega of America localized it, they jacked up the difficulty quite a bit, covering up the females, removing the gay boss Ash, and switched a bunch of the little details around, like the color of the outfits on the main characters. The PAL releases were mostly based on the North American version, though it too had its own cover art. The third entry here remains a heated topic of debate among Sega fans. Some of us enjoy the changes, while others absolutely despised them. Some of these name changes were just simply a result of keeping the original names of the arcade versions for that region. That was the case with Growl, a beat-em-up where you are out to stop some animal poachers from trapping and selling exotic animals. In Japan, this was known as Runarch, and had the same cover art as it did in the West. There was a French release for this that went under Runarch as well, as did the Korean version. This isn't a bad game, but it lost its multiplayer entirely in the transition to the Genesis, now just one player instead of 4. The visuals also took a major hit, but fortunately it plays mostly the same. Could have been special with 2 players, but as it is, it's just average. The Japanese Battle Mania was known as Troubleshooter in the US, an unconventional shooter that had 2 female characters connected to one another. The gameplay could scroll both horizontally and vertically, and you had the ability to shoot both directions. The visuals and sound were nice, and I always dug the uniqueness of the gameplay and presentation. The Japanese and US versions also differed in a number of story elements as well. The main heroes were called Mania and Maria in Japan, while being called Madison and Crystal in the US. The main bad guy was called Morgstein in Japan, and Blackball in the US edition. You'll also notice that the 2 regions had some very different box art. It was followed by a Japanese-only sequel that was pretty good itself. Gemfire was a turn-based strategy game from Koei, a 1992 release that was also called Royal Blood in Japan. It is basically set up to where you take control of a country that is part of a larger island. Each family has their own story and struggle to overcome, and you'll need to do battle with or forge relationships with the other nations. This didn't appear in Europe on the Mega Drive, but it did see numerous ports to other platforms. Not an unmissable classic, but I'd say it's worth a look if you enjoy the genre. Sometimes a name change was just headache-inducing for its stupidity. That was certainly the case with 1992's Thunder Force 4. The Japanese and PAL regions went with the same name and box art, continuing the connection to a well-loved and respected series of releases. When this was dropped in the US, someone decided that the Thunder Force name was no longer good enough, and it was rebranded Lightning Force: Quest for the Dark Star. Yep, we get this nonsense, complete with what I can only assume is a purposeful misspelling to try and sound unique, instead of the classic name the series had already established. This was a shame for a number of reasons, because they also redid the US box art, which actually wasn't bad at all. It was published by Sega in the US, so I can only assume this was some choice by Sega of America in an attempt to spur sales. One of the worst name changes of that generation. Sometimes a game would split the name of the original arcade game between two regions. The original 1988 release of Atomic Runner Chillnov is a classic auto-running action game that came to the Genesis in 1992. In Japan it was simply known as Chillnov, and in the West it held on to only the Atomic Runner part. It was also interesting to see that each region also changed the box art quite a bit. If you haven't played this one, it's a pretty big upgrade over the arcade original, now with much better visuals and a nicer soundtrack. Biohazard Battle was a side-scrolling shooter that had a very unique organic art design to the ships and enemies. The US and PAL regions kept the same name and box art, but the Japanese edition was known as Crying and came with a very different looking case. If you enjoy shoot 'em ups and have never tried this, you might want to set aside some time and give it a try. Everything about it is different from your typical release in the genre. Piloting your bioship, your job is to go in and eliminate the hostiles so a new colony can be settled on the planet. Most of the enemies you face are alive, sometimes looking pretty creepy and not the usual metallic war machines you are used to. Think along the lines of Salamander or Life Force, and you'll have an inkling of what to expect. (1992) gave us the rather mediocre fighter Deadly Moves. There's only a couple of moves per fighter, there's only one punch and one kick, and there's a third button for jump. You move up and down the playfield kinda like a beat 'em up. It does have a cool upgrade system as you win, but it just doesn't play all that well. It falls right in line with many of the games in the genre before Street Fighter II came along and redefined everything. Funny enough, the Japanese release went by Power Athlete, making it sound like a track and field game or something. The Japanese version also has the superior box art for those of you that care. Even the Super Nintendo edition had a different name, going by Power Moves the following year. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a well-loved franchise that spawned a pretty good game on the old Sega Genesis called the Hyperstone Heist in 1992. As you all know, this was a beat-em up that brought the two arcade games together in one mashup of two-player action. But as much as I loved this one, I much preferred the Japanese version's box art and name, known there as Return of the Shredder. That's not to say the US box art was bad, because it was pretty solid itself. But what's interesting is that the PAL regions got its own box art and naming scheme in 1993. In many countries it was called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, the Hyperstone Heist, reflecting the sudden paranoia gripping many nations that ninja were far too violent for kids' entertainment. The art also took on a brighter and much more cartoonish style, further downplaying the violence associated with the IP. Say what you want about the content, I still find this the best playing Turtles game of the 16-bit era.
Pizza time!
1993 was a great year for the Genesis, and one reason why was releases like Ranger X. This was a crazy action game where you controlled a giant mech and his battle platforms that offered both offensive and defensive capabilities. The visuals were impressive, the challenge offered a ton of replayability, and it even sounded good. PAL regions used the same name and similar box art, but when it was released in Japan, it was known as X-Ranza or EX-Ranza. And just take a look at that incredible cover. Front and back, I love the look of it. This game can take time to get accustomed to the gameplay, but once you do, it's one of the 16-bit era's finest. Fatal Rewind here was an interesting puzzle action game released in 1991. It was based off of an Amiga title called The Killing Game Show, where you need to guide your robot through traps and rising asset levels as enemies impede your every step. The rewind part comes in because you have the ability to take control of a replay feature and try again to erase a previous mistake. What's weird about this one is that EA renamed the PAL version Fatal Rewind as well. An odd choice given the Amiga's popularity. Even stranger, Japan got it nearly full 2 years later under the name The Killing Game Show. All regions use a similar box art with a few layout changes, and I can't really say I'm fond of any of them. Castlevania Bloodlines is one of my very favorite Genesis games. I loved it all. The visuals, the sound, the gameplay, everything. It had two vampire hunters with different weapons and powers hunting down and killing the minions of evil in their bid to stop the resurrection of Count Dracula. It was a great continuation of the look and feel established by the NES, now with 16-bit effects that really amped up the presentation. The Japanese version was known as Vampire Killer and came with some very different box art. The most interesting release, however, had to be the PAL edition. It was renamed as Castlevania The New Generation and had some changes in regards to censorship. The blood and gore elements have been removed, such as the title screen and dead bodies littered throughout the stages. I have read that the Australian release kept the European name change, but none of the censorship. Blood or not, this was a great game and I highly recommend it. Did you ever think that a Sonic clone could be made using a time-traveling android duck? Well, that's exactly what you get in Socket, a 1993 release for the Genesis that bears more than a few similarities to the Little Blue Blur. I mean, take a look at what you're seeing. Aside from some art direction differences, you could drop Sonic into this, and I doubt he'd skip a beat. I admit I do love the parallax in the backgrounds, and it's certainly colorful enough, but the gameplay feels really off. It doesn't flow nearly as well as Sonic, and your attack is an awkward kick that is really easy to miss time. When it released in Japan the following year, it was renamed Time Dominator First, and came with completely new box art, and a renamed hero that is now known as Minute. I think it gets a bit too much hate for what it is, but there's no question it's a shameless ripoff of a much better game. "1994 gave us a port of Grindstormer, a vertically scrolling toa-plan shoot-'em-up. It was based on the arcade release, and I hate to say it, but Tengen did a pretty poor job porting this. You see a lot less of the screen in the home version, making it easier to get overwhelmed by enemies. The sound and visuals are also rather poor in comparison, leaving you wondering why this wasn't moved to the Saturn since it was only a few months away. It's not terrible, just disappointing overall. The Japanese release was known as V5 and has completely different cover art. Fortunately, both regions have both versions of the game, which have different methods of selecting speed and power-ups. I've read many places that claim the PCB used for the North American cartridges were defective, causing failures that require repair in many of those cartridges. Never seen that for myself, but would love to hear your stories in the comments. The Sega Genesis got a pretty good Zelda clone in 1995 called Crusader of Cinti. It really did look the part, and had the gameplay that elevated it well above the typical adventure games you saw for the platform. It was a localized version of the Japanese release that was known as Ragna Cinti, which, as you probably have guessed, came with a pretty different box cover as well. And yep, even the PAL regions got a different box art and name, known there as Soleel. This is a total package of impressive sound, great graphics, and a story you'll want to see to the very end. Contra Hardcore on the Genesis is perhaps one of the very best run-and guns. I mean, how can you not love that action, those special effects, and the two-player co-op? The Japanese version, called Contra the Hardcore, was an easier time thanks to having 3 hit points for each life, and unlimited continues, something that really helped you immensely in the late game. That Japanese release also came with some very different cover art that was much more cartoonish than the North American variant. Europe saw a name change known there as Probotector, new box art, as well as a reskin of many of the characters. Even the story was changed around a bit to reflect the more robotic nature of the presentation. Mega Man The Wiley Wars was released in 1994 in PAL regions, a compilation of the first 3 NES games with added bonus content exclusive to this version. The Japanese region got Rockman Mega World, essentially the same game with that country's branding. The US never received a physical release back then and only got a Sega Channel version that same year. This isn't a bad set of games and actually has a cool theme of time travel as Dr. Wiley tries to undo the previous battles with Mega Man. The visuals could have been better and I would have loved to have seen some gameplay enhancements, but for fans of the series, it should be more than enough to get you excited. The last game we'll be covering is Beyond Oasis, a top-down adventure first released in 1994. This was known as the story of Thor, a successor of the Light in both Japan and many of the PAL regions. In France it was simply called The Legend of Thor. All three regions also got different box art, with Japan picking up the win as my favorite. This is an absolute gem of a game, and a massive 24 megabit adventure that has huge bosses, puzzles, items to discover, and a presentation that rivaled the best on the platform. I feel like a lot of people sleep on this one, thinking it's a simple Zelda clone. Don't, because it's so much more than that. So there we go, our look at some of the games that got name changes across the various regions. I was always curious why some of these got the changes they did. Not just the names, but the box art as well. I would love to have been a fly on the wall back then and heard some of the conversations that led to the changes, because you just know some of them were made for the most hilarious reasons. Some of these make for interesting collector pieces as well, especially if you love box art variants or regional changes to content. I myself own all three Castlevania titles for the Genesis, for example, partially because I love the game, but also I was always fascinated by the changes and differences. As I mentioned earlier, many of these I had no idea about until some years later. You just had no way to know back then unless you actually played the game or a magazine covered the changes in detail. Even though I covered quite a few in this episode, I know there are more, so feel free to rattle off the ones I missed down in the comments. I'm Sega X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.